Hey guys, and welcome back to the Young Watchery. In today's video, we're going to be talking about one of my favorite independent Swiss watchmakers of all time, and that is the legendary Doxa. Now this video is going to be sort of a comprehensive guide to everything you would need and want to know about this brand. And first, we're going to talk about the history of the brand because you guys know that I like to sort of give that historical perspective of the brand. Before I jump into that, I'll do a quick wristwatch check. Today I am wearing my own personal Doxa. This is actually a vintage, well it's actually a new old stock piece from the 70s. Beautiful little two-hander dress watch, manual wind, has some onyx on the crown. Really interesting piece. I might do a video on this later. And I'm wearing it on this one-piece nylon strap from Brooks Brothers. Doesn't really fit the flannel, but it is a bit of a chilly day out here on the West Coast, so we gotta keep it real. So let's jump into history here. Now I'm just warning you guys in advance, I am going to butcher a few of these pronunciations. Sorry, I just don't know how they're pronounced. I'll give it my best shot. So in 1889, Georges Ducommun founded Doxa. And quite an interesting guy. He came from a poor family, and at age 12, he was apprenticed to a watch assembler, which is crazy to think that at age 12, he was already learning how to assemble watches. At age 20, he then decided to open his own repair business, essentially working out of this workshop in his backyard, right? So I mean, he was a pretty driven guy, it's safe to say. And he earned a very good reputation as a watch repairman, but his true passion was really that he wanted to create his own watches. So in 1910, he registered the name Doxa, which is Greek for glory, apparently. Who knew? So from there, basically, he decided to focus on a number of things, including, but not limited to, instruments for automobile racing, which, of course, was sort of becoming quite the thing at that time. Bugatti, one of the most innovative, respected, admirable, and iconic car makers of all time, actually used a number of instruments from Doxa, including their 8-day movement, which he had patented way back in 1908, so 2 years before he even registered the name for the company. So if you're a car enthusiast like I am, you will obviously have heard of Bugatti and be familiar with their cars, both old and modern, and it's really cool to think of a brand like Doxa making instruments and clocks for these cars. It's also incredible to think that in 1908, he patented an 8-day movement. I mean, that's crazy. And I mean, he must have been incredibly young by then. I mean, he was like, what, 18 years old? That's just crazy. Anyway, passing away in 1936, after having continued to make lots of different extremely accurate complications in watches and instruments for cars and automobile racing, the company was passed off to Jacques Nardin, the grandson of Ulysses Nardin, of course, another very, very interesting small watchmaker. So he took over where Georges left off. Doxa went on to produce a whole variety of different watches, dress watches, travel watches, lots of different sports watches for different stuff. Really interesting, just a lot of different watches. They used some interesting complications for the time, such as alarms, date pointers, some chronographs, and even jumping seconds hands, like I believe that's the same thing as a deadbeat second hand, so like a quartz hand, second hand, but on a mechanical watch. Then in 1958, Doxa released the Graphic, and this is one of the first true Bauhaus-inspired watches ever, and I just think it's absolutely gorgeous. I'll put up a photo to make sure you guys can see what I'm talking about. I don't know how much these go for today, but I think they're just stunning. I love the aesthetic, I love the case, I love the Bauhaus-ness of it. And again, this really solidified Doxa's position as being ahead of their time, right? They were thinking ahead stylistically, but also functionally. In the late 1960s, as diving became more and more mainstream with the invention of the aqualung, Doxa decided to focus on the designing and manufacturing of dive watches. So during this process, it was determined that the orange was the most visible, especially in murky water, and that of course sort of became their signature Doxa dive watch look with that beautiful orange dial. During this process, Doxa consulted with a whole host of professional divers and people with experience in that field, such as Jacques Cousteau, however his name is pronounced. You guys know the famous French diver, who's also the chairman of U.S. Divers at the time. They also consulted with Claude Wesley, a companion of Cousteau, and the first man to spend 7 days, 33 feet underwater, which is just crazy. He was also the first man to swim across the Mediterranean in 1962. Anyway, long story short, after a lot of testing, in 1967, Doxa released the Sub 300, which was their first serious dive watch. It had, of course, their iconic orange face and that rotating bezel, which features the U.S. Navy air dive table for no decompression times, along with the standard 60-minute count-up bezel scale, I guess. And Doxa filed for a patent on that particular part. They still hold it today. As the name suggests, the watch was water resistant to 300 meters. And you know, it really should be noted that along with a few other brands like Blancpain, Rolex, Omega, Zodiac, Doxa is one of the first companies to really delve into serious dive watches, and even more importantly, bringing serious dive watches to the consumer market. So that's really cool. I love diving culture, and I love Doxa, of course. And again, this is really due mainly to diving becoming a lot more mainstream, especially with younger generations, as the nation sort of, under the JFK administration, the new frontier, that sort of mentality, people were really expanding into these new sports, these new horizons. And of course, as diving was becoming something more than just something for the military and the super wealthy. The watch also featured Doxa's iconic, it's sort of like a tonneau cushion case. I don't even know how to describe it. I'll put up a photo. This has sort of become their signature case shape for the Sub. And it was 45 millimeters in diameter, which at the time was really quite large, and paired with an orange face, which no one was doing. It was quite a statement piece, to say the least. But a true dive watch, a true watch. And yeah, that was, the Sub was definitely a success. The watch also had the dwarf hour hand, which again, guys, I'll put up a photo. Basically, this just means that it featured a very small hour hand, which was meant to put more emphasis on the minute hand. Of course, at least for recreational diving, the minute hand is important just so you can keep track of how long you're underwater. And yeah, the hour hand's not really that important unless you're like saturation diving, and then it might be. What else? The bracelet was also quite innovative for the time, and it featured a diver's extension and also a ratcheting clasp that allowed for sort of on-the-go bracelet adjustment without the removal of links, not unlike the modern Rolex Oyster Glide clasps. What else? The following year, Doxa updated this model with the Sub 300T. Now, if you know your dive watches and whatnot, you'll know that the T stands for tritium. And so this watch basically had luminous material in the hands, the indices, and also, I believe, the pip on the bezel. These watches were also distributed by Aqualung under U.S. divers. So, if you haven't figured it out by now, Doxa is becoming a very, very serious and respected dive watch brand. Then in 1969, Doxa again made history by releasing the first commercial dive watch to incorporate a helium release valve under the name Conquistador. These vintage Conquistadors have in fact become some of the most sought after vintage Doxas ever. Again, I don't know what the prices on these guys are, but I do know that they are quite desirable. But it was actually Rolex who invented the first helium release valve for watches in 1969, the same year, but before Doxa. But these were reserved only for small quantities of watches that were only for Comex divers and sold to other commercial diving companies. I think I said commercial earlier. What I meant was consumer when I said Doxa was the first one to develop the consumer helium release valve, right? So, because it wasn't until 1972 that Rolex released the Sea Dweller with the helium release valve for public consumption. So Doxa was in fact the first one to release a watch with the helium release valve for the consumer market. Anyway, at this time things were looking pretty bright for Doxa, but then with the onset of the quartz crisis, small brands like Doxa were hit extremely hard, and while every brand around Doxa, sort of went dormant or extinct, Doxa struggled, and they sort of went dormant for a good number of years, and the Sub in this time just, it sort of faded into obscurity, unfortunately. It wasn't until 1999 when Rick Murray, I hope that's somewhat correct pronunciation there, a diver himself, approached the owners of Doxa and was hoping for the brand to make a comeback. It was his opinion that people were slowly beginning to rekindle an appreciation for unique mechanical watches, and he thought that Doxa fit the bill. He also felt that the internet would provide a much better platform for small brands like Doxa to sell their watches. So quite a visionary, once again, at the helm of Doxa. So in August 2002, Doxa reissued the Sub 300T, the 35th anniversary, and it went for sale only on the internet. Again, really ahead of its time. The watch came in two versions. One was just the standard, with the orange dial, right, so reminiscent of its predecessors. The other version also had an orange dial, but it also featured the Sea Hunters logo in tribute of Dr. Clive Cussler and the Sea Hunters, which is a group dedicated to exploring and diving shipwrecks. Both versions were introduced in limited editions of 1,000 pieces, and both sold out very quickly. So after 15 years of being completely dormant, the Doxa Sub was once again in production. So a really cool comeback story. And Doxa distinguished itself from other companies by really being one of the first small watchmakers to directly take feedback from its customers and incorporate that into the designing of other watches. Also, I want to point out that they've branched out from the orange dial, which is now known as the Professional, to include watches with black dials, which is called the Shark Hunter, blue dials, known as the the blue dial is known as the Caribbean, my bad. And they also have lots of other dial colors. A lot of their watches today are limited editions, featuring the logos from historical diving companies. I'll put up photos again so you guys can see what I'm talking about. They've also released special editions such as the Project Aware 2, limited to 300 pieces, which features a really cool turquoise dial. And basically, it's to raise awareness for this nonprofit that's hoping to preserve our oceans by saving sharks and also eliminating marine debris, and some of the profits from those watches goes to that cause. Some of their watches also feature chronographs and power reserves, but they only produce dive watches these days. So the future looks bright for Doxa, and if you guys can't tell, I'm a huge fan. I absolutely love Doxa. They're sort of one of the few Swiss independent watchmakers that aren't like super high-end haute horology, FP Journe type. And don't get me wrong, I love brands like that too, but it is kind of cool to see brands like Doxa, I guess Oris is another good example, producing some real true watches and still being independent. So now that we've covered the history of Doxa, I want to briefly talk about my passion for Doxa, where it started, and why I really like them. So I first started becoming interested in Doxa watches when I watched the movie Sahara, I think, yeah. And Matthew McConaughey, who else is in there? I think Penelope Cruz. Anyway, Matthew McConaughey wears a Doxa Sub in that movie, and it is an excellent bit of watch casting. He's a professional wreck diver in that movie, if I recall. After that, I was like, what is that? What is that? I'll put a photo of him wearing it in the movie. I started looking into it, and I just fell in love with the brand. So let's talk about the 3 reasons why I love Doxa. First is, like I've mentioned before, they're an independent company, right? And they've made this comeback. So that's just cool. I love brands that sort of make their comeback, that stick to their guns, that don't get bought out. That's really cool. I love that, So major props to them for that. Secondly is that they are unique and also innovative. And that's quite an important combination because, we live in this world where so many people who are still wearing watches are wearing these pretty generic steel sports watches. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with a Rolex Submariner or an Omega Seamaster. These are great watches, but they're just sort of generic. I mean, let's just be honest. These are watches with great history and whatnot, but they're so mainstream that it's just like, when I see someone wearing one, it's just so uninteresting, you know? That's just the truth. A company like Doxa, on the other hand, has a long history of some serious innovation. And, you know, they also just have a very unique look with that cushion case, with that bead of rice bracelet, with that bezel that I've heard from divers is an absolute pleasure to use, especially when wearing neoprene gloves. It sort of has those, you know, ratcheting, I don't even know what you want to call it. I'll put up a photo so you guys can see what I'm talking about. It looks like super easy to turn. I have actually handled a few of the Doxa Subs in person. This is the only Doxa I own. I don't own a Doxa Sub. I wish, maybe soon. They're a little big, but they do have some 42.5 millimeter subs as well. So anyway, I love the aesthetic. You know, I love the orange dial. If it's not for you, then there's the black dial, there's blue dials, there's turquoise dials, there's silver dials. You know, and I get it that aesthetic's not going to be for everyone, but I do think it's really cool. And when I see someone wearing a Doxa, which is not often, you know that there's someone who's going to be interesting to talk to. So that's really cool. The third reason that I love Doxa is that they're truly dedicated to dive watches, right? Historically, they did do lots of other things besides just dive watches, but when they saw the opportunity when they saw the need, right, the consumer need for dive watches, they decided to just focus their efforts and really do everything they could to produce the best dive watches. And I think that's really cool and really respectable, you know. In many ways, Doxa today is sort of like what Rolex was with the Submariner back in the 50s, right? These were true tool watches. They weren't marketed as luxury watches. They weren't, you know, you're paying for quality. You're not paying for marketing and stuff like that. You're not paying for prestige necessarily. I mean, Doxa is, in my opinion, a prestigious company, but, you know, you're mainly paying for the quality and the craftsmanship and the design and the innovation that goes into these watches. You know, as a PADI certified diver myself, I do have a lot of respect for these dive watch companies, and I just love diving culture in general. Furthermore, guys, you know your company produces some pretty serious dive watches when in the official PADI Open Water Diver Certification Manual book, whatever, there's a picture of a Doxa Sub right there. So anyway, guys, in conclusion, thanks so much for watching. I hope you guys have learned something. If you have, I'd really appreciate getting a subscription and a thumbs up. And if you guys have any questions, comments, whatever, please leave them down below, and I'll get back to you guys as quickly as possible. Thanks again for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.